Welcome to our event tonight. My name is Dan DeLeo, and I'm a theology professor at Creighton University, where I also direct the Justice and Peace Studies program. Tonight's event is meant to advance community dialogue about how Nebraska's public power could expand distributed solar generation to provide more reliable, affordable, and clean energy that benefits both people and planet. Here in our state, Nebraska Public Power District, Lincoln Electric System, and Omaha Public Power District have all pledged to reach net zero carbon pollution by 2050. These commitments reflect the very best of who we are, responsible communities that promote the common good through science-based policies that conserve the natural world for future generations, with particular concern for the poor, vulnerable, and marginalized. Despite these ideals, December's extension of the coal units at OPPD's North Omaha station shows just how difficult it will be to keep these promises. The extension was a confluence of many connected variables, including corporate interests, industrial customer energy demand, lack of knowledge, misinformation, and interference from the state's executive branch. Amidst these challenges, distributed solar can help our state remain on the path to responsible energy generation. As our speaker will describe, distributed solar puts small-scale generation at the point of energy consumption. This maximizes efficiency, security, flexibility, and grid support. Distributed solar could be deployed across the state. Unfortunately, it's a vastly underutilized solution. There are many reasons for this, but one way to increase deployment is through more robust use of a concept called value of solar. Again, as we'll hear tonight in greater detail, value of solar is a method by which utilities establish a rate price for distributed solar and credit the bills of system owners based on how much power they generate. Although value of solar can incentivize customer owners to deploy distributed solar, it's only effective if the true value of solar is accounted for when establishing the rate of price of generation credit. As we saw with the Attorney General's lawsuit against OPPD, some people only want to value immediate financial benefits. However, industry best practices recognize that the true value of distributed solar includes much more. Economically, the value of solar includes avoided financial costs to the utility from energy generation, new facility construction, transmission and distribution infrastructure, fuel price instability, and lack of grid resiliency. Socially, the value of solar includes avoided financial costs and hardships to the community from avoiding the negative health impacts of fossil fuel combustion. These impacts have been documented for decades and were highlighted at Creighton's event in December with public health experts from Harvard, Brown, Virginia Tech, and George Mason University. These impacts include asthma and COPD, birth defects, cancer, and premature deaths, all of which disproportionately impact economically impoverished neighborhoods and communities of color. Environmentally, the value of solar includes avoided financial costs and ecological degradation from local pollution and climate change. As the recent state climate assessment documented, these environmental costs threaten Nebraska's future, especially our water systems and agriculture. The value of solar is a tool for public policy. As a Catholic, however, I can't help but notice how the concept echoes decades of Catholic social teaching, especially articulated 16 years ago by Pope Benedict XVI. Quote, "It is not hard to see that environmental degradation is often due to the lack of far-sighted official policies or to the pursuit of myopic economic interests, which then tragically become a serious threat to creation. When making use of natural resources, we should be concerned for their protection and consider the cost entailed environmentally and socially as an essential part of the overall expenses incurred." Tonight's speaker will highlight best practices for calculating the true value of solar. His insights come at an especially important moment. Lincoln Electric System is currently assessing the value of solar as part of its integrated resource planning. This is LES's first value of solar study since 2014. Similarly, Omaha Public Power District is embarking on its 5-year integrated system plan. To help our communities consider the value of solar, I'm pleased to introduce tonight's speaker. Keith Benish is an instructor at his undergraduate alma mater, the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. Previously, he served as a senior advisor at the U.S. Department of Energy, a fellow at Columbia University's Center on Global Energy Policy, and as an advisor at the U.S. Department of State, where he managed production of environmental impact statements and advised on diplomacy around the Green Climate Fund and the United Nations Paris Agreement. In addition to his BA from UNL, Keith earned a JD, magna cum laude, from Georgetown University Law Center, from which he graduated after completing his LLM at the London School of Economics and Political Science, from which he graduated with merit. So Keith, we're very, very grateful for you making the time to be with us tonight and look forward to the insights that you can share with our community.
Thank you, Dan, and welcome everybody. I'm very honored that you asked me. I'm just sending a share request to you now through Zoom so I can share my screen. Very honored that you asked me to give this presentation. I split my time between Washington, D.C. and Nebraska. Recently got the appointment at the law school to be doing research around siting and permitting issues generally, and excited to join this discussion around these incredibly important issues. As Dan mentioned, I'm a visiting researcher at the University of Nebraska Law School. He gave some of my background. I have over 20 years of experience in energy and environmental law and policy in the government, advising large corporate clients and working from the local level up to the international negotiations that Dan mentioned. A few of my most recent activities that are sort of relevant to what we're doing here now in terms of the resume are, previously done research around issues around the sort of including the cost of societal issues and the cost of electricity. I'm currently, working with a group of research scientists that are trying to develop foundation models for the electric grid to try and improve grid planning and expansions, as well as having launched a Permit AI project that's ongoing at Pacific Northwest National Lab, where we're trying to use AI models to improve siting and permitting for large-scale infrastructure. The key questions that Dan shared with me when he asked me to do the presentation is, what have other places done in their value of solar studies? There have been 20 or more value of solar studies that have tackled these issues. How do other areas measure the environmental and social benefits? Does the value of solar change over the year, and how has that been quantified? And how have studies tried to quantify capacity transmission losses in other studies? We're not going to go in super technical detail on each of these, but I'm happy to take follow-up questions on them, but just want to get everybody comfortable with a lot of the basic concepts that underlie these studies. And the presentation, I'm going to start with just a little bit of context about electricity price trends and then run into the other items mentioned here. And so this is something that in Nebraska, folks, we've been insulated more than other parts of the country, but I'm sure you've seen in the news that lots of issues around energy affordability, around price increases recently. A lot of the blame goes on data centers, and they might be a source of price increases in the future, or in other parts of the country, like around the Virginia area where there are so many. But in the big picture, and a sort of a thing for people to keep in mind of what's driven the price increases, where they have occurred, is that it comes down to some relatively simple categories of things that I've sort of, in an offhand way, of termed fires, wires, and war. And that is, some of the biggest price increases have come because of wildfires in California and elsewhere in the West, and extreme weather events in the U.S. Gulf Coast. So that's both the expenses of having to recover from these disasters, in the case of utilities in California, having to pay the liability from having contributed or caused some of the wildfires, and for the extreme weather events in the Gulf, again, having to rebuild, or all these things rebuild afterwards or harden against those sorts of things happening. The wires, actually, the costs are coming mostly from upgrades to distribution electric systems in other parts of the country. And the war is actually, from when Russia invaded Ukraine and there was a spike in natural gas prices worldwide, it's sort of a stand-in for the specific instance of just that volatility that can occur around fuel supplies and around our supply chains. And even though in the United States we produce more natural gas than we use and we produce more crude oil than we use, as long as we're tied to those world markets because we export natural gas and we export oil to world markets, those sorts of disruptions around the world still impact the prices that we pay at home. Some of the commentary around this has talked about the impacts of renewables and tried to blame renewables perhaps for some of the price increases. And they've had a mixed effect in that in most places where there's been large renewables expansion in, say, Texas, for example, where they absolutely leading the country in wind and solar and battery storage deployment, those sorts of areas, renewables have a modest downward pressure on prices. In places that instituted, especially early on, renewable portfolio standards, that's had a modest price increase pressure on electricity prices, which is not surprising because by design, renewable portfolio standards were things where they wanted to deploy slightly higher cost in the near term resources because of the other societal benefits that the voters decided in those states. And then in a very discrete part of areas, in California in particular, the vast uptake of rooftop solar, where under the previous ways that they were accounting for that, the study found that there were price increases associated with that. But again, that's a small geographic area, even though it's larger. So that's given that general context. The sort of stewards of the electricity system, the public power systems in Nebraska have maintained, for all of the Nebraskans, relatively low prices compared to other parts of the country and stable prices. But now, as Dan mentioned, it's the time to look at how in the electricity system going forward can we continue to ensure that we're deploying those resources in a cost-effective, affordable way while taking account of the full cost of the resources that we use. A lot of what's in this presentation here comes from this particular study, which was just done, released in January 2025 from one of the national labs. And they did an overview of every value of solar study that's been done in the last 20 years or since people started doing them. And the key thing to think about here is we think about how we determine what the appropriate value is for these resources that can be deployed, on people's rooftops or on business roofs. Is there are these different categories of costs that you can take into account in these studies. The largest categories of costs are going to be around generation, which is energy and capacity here, and then there's transmission and distribution and the cost impacts there. And a growing amount of studies have started to consider more a broader set of the social components, that is the environmental costs, and also some of the benefits, the environmental costs of the existing traditional generators dependent on fossil fuels, and the benefits of distributed energy generation and storage. And as you do these studies and as you go through the cost components, one of the key things to keep in mind for the policymakers, for the public, is there's always this trade-off where any one of those categories of issues, of cost factors there, you could really dive into and do an incredibly deep dive and take years studying it. And that's what researchers do. They take years studying it and still have questions left. But some of those things might be worth doing because we think there are large costs or benefits associated with them. Some of those might not be worth doing because even though it's interesting, they probably don't have that big of an impact and it's not worth the time and expense of doing the studies. And so as we think through these issues and walk through this 2x2 chart here, kind of gives those sorts of trade-offs that both the policymakers and the public, right, with these being public utilities, should think about in terms of, the benefit of identifying the big costs, right? Ideally, you would have easy to find data and modeling about things that have big benefits, and the things that are hard to quantify are pretty small anyway. That's not always the case. So you have that balance between the effort and what kind, how much useful information you can get out of that. And another thing highlighted, and again, this is from that 2025 study, that it talks about sort of the principles behind the value of solar studies, and talking about when they're thinking about them in terms of setting a tariff, setting a rate on what might be compensated. The value of solar is trying to do market efficient compensation for that full value, not just of the electricity produced, but the other benefits that come from the deployment of that solar. Again, along with other types of utility rate making, to be sort of in that the fairness and the equity that's inherent in those utility rate makings should enable the utility to recoup its costs, fairly allocate the costs amongst both the people who decide to, who can afford to deploy rooftop solar or battery storage there. And if there are cost impacts on those who are not able to do that, to take account of that, and also reflect the incremental benefits and costs. One thing to note about what these studies say is that, net energy metering, where you just pay for the electricity generated by a rooftop system, by the retail rate, and don't consider the other things, is not necessarily inconsistent with these principles. But as utilities and stakeholders and the public have found that sort of just going on that net metering value is not accurate enough, and generally find that it doesn't capture that values of the cost and benefits. Sorry. And so I mentioned that this general study has been a survey of all the previous studies, and they found that there's been this wide range of values that have put on solar energy production. And this is a summary chart that was included in one of the studies that summarizes all of the previous ones. And you'll see there's about a factor of 10 difference between those at the lowest level, which are Montana here in the original study, and Maryland is amongst the highest in that study, and about a factor of 10 between those. And this breaks down the different values that were given to the different components of that value stack that we'll talk about a little bit more. In general, that electricity produced isn't necessarily vastly different at these two places. So why is there this 10x difference? And a lot of it in this case, if we look at Maryland, for their specific case, they came out with a much higher valuation for the value of solar because they included into the study on a lot of the local economic benefits from it. So Maryland is on the far left in this chart. The top part of the bar that's very dark is all their calculation of the economic development, and that's economic development benefits from it, is what that is. Whereas if you look at two to the right of that, you have Maine that also had a very high valuation for their value of solar. And that's broken down differently amongst the different components, where you can see that they have market price reductions that they've estimated. They have the social and environmental factors in there, which are around the sort of social cost of carbon and valuing the air pollution, but also other items. And then the LES study that was previously done in 2014 and presented to the board came in closer to what Montana, a recent study, had done, where they had done the valuation of the solar as well. So the previous LES study is not out of, it's on one end of the spectrum. It's not out of line with the sort of values of those. But part of what we're going to dig into now is a little bit more in general about what drives these price differences in the studies. Sorry, there we go. So the biggest drivers in the differences in values, one is it's just local grid conditions. How congested is the distribution grid? Are there new areas of demand? How is that going? That's going to vary a lot from place to place. Local retail electricity rates has a big impact on what that value is, as do the differences in generation costs. You're looking at studies here that cover different types of markets, some that are entirely regulated, some that are entirely competitive and unregulated. They have different ways that they participate in the larger balancing markets in their region and across the states. And then the studies have just included different factors that they've quantified in those value stacks. Now, those different factors that were quantified in there that can be influenced by who commissioned the study. Was it by a state regulator who's looking across a variety of utilities and looking across a large transmission and distribution system and generation system that serves the population in a lot of geographic areas? Is it by an individual utility, which that is doing it just for a more limited area that has less transmission, more distribution, et cetera? The single biggest drivers in these valuations across all these studies, though, has generally been the calculations for avoided energy. That is, how much generation, how many kilowatt hours of electricity did we not have to purchase and generate from our existing generators? And avoided capacity, which is how long are we able to delay having to make that big capital expense from adding more generation capacity or adding more distribution or transmission capacity? And overall, the trends in the analysis over this sort of 15 to 20-year time period that they've been done is that they've generally been becoming more comprehensive and detailed. They're expanding the value, not just distributed solar, but distributed energy resources more broadly. And distributed energy resources means additional energy efficiency, sort of could be appliances, could be water heater, or the central air conditioning or heating in a home that has a smart thermostat and or a smart meter that can be controlled centrally by the utility. It can mean battery storage that's behind the meter at homes or businesses. It could mean a variety of other sort of efforts to just do these coordinated efforts by utility to reduce the peak loads. Additional trends is that recurring studies are now happening. People are coming back to revisit them. We're kind of holding these studies as not a fixed value over many years, but just revisiting them regularly as market conditions change and as technology changes. That's something that I think is going to be particularly important over the next 5 to 10 years and longer, as we just have such massive disruption in the reduced costs of alternative generation or storage technologies. The most recent studies that we're going to talk a little more about in a second have quantified the avoided cost of carbon. They've done a social cost of carbon of some sense, and have also quantified other avoided environmental costs. Studies done earlier, sort of pre-2018, were much more mixed. Some included these, some did not. I'll also say that in the last 10 years, there's been a huge improvement in our understanding of these issues, of both the cost of carbon and the cost of other air pollutants in particular, and the availability of scientific studies, online calculators, things that can be used to bring more transparency to how these values are calculated. So what would have seemed, unthinkable to try and do, or would have required, several $100,000 of study in 2008, can now be done based on just what's available in open source and online reports and tools. Distribution capacity itself was valued in 3 and 4 of the recent studies, whereas earlier studies had generally deemed this too difficult to quantify. And also the studies more, instead of just setting a point value to say it's the value of solar is 10 cents per kilowatt hour, have given results that account for uncertainty and the sensitivity of the analyses. So they give those results that say, if we assume X things will happen, then it might be 7 cents. If we assume Y, we think it might be 15 cents. And the real value of solar is somewhere in between. And then, that's for the kind of the policy and the public participation to help figure out where to make it land to reflect the community values. I'm going to have to start going a little bit faster through some of these just to make sure that we have plenty of time for questions. This chart here, this table here, shows what was and was not quantified in the most recent value of solar studies. That is the 4 studies that were done between 2018 and 2022. And you can see there what I've already sort of summarized in terms of across the avoided energy and avoided capacity. All of them have quantified that. All of them have quantified an avoided cost of carbon. All of them have quantified other avoided environmental costs, which are primarily, and I think maybe exclusively, other local air pollutants. And this is a good summary for folks to look at across these different cost categories of what has been valued. So coming now to Dan's questions that he shared with me is the first question that how does the value of solar change over the course of the year or in different places? How's that been quantified? And the answer is that most of the studies still have not done a variable sort of cost of solar, taking account of the different times of day or the different amounts that are generated at different times of the year. The one that has in New Hampshire already had sort of a system of calculating these hour by hour, efficiency measures, right? So they had a system that they could build on to do these calculations. That said, just because they had a system doesn't mean that it was, and the others didn't, doesn't mean that it's too difficult to do. It is, there are a number, again, scenario where just in the last few years, there have been some larger scale studies that have looked at the values of generation versus load on an hour by hour basis across different geographies in the United States. And while they weren't specifically looking at value of solar in terms of distributed solar, they would have insights that a value of solar study could take advantage of with relatively low effort. The valuation for transmission and distribution, the general findings in the studies, highly location dependent. In many cases, these values have been estimated to be zero because the additional amount of generation that one would get from the distributed energy resources were not enough to significantly change the timing of additional capital investments on the transmission or distribution system. Now, especially for the transmission system, if you're making an additional investment in that, that's a very high hundreds of millions of dollars or more. And so that happens in a kind of very lumpy way, right? You can go a long time without having to invest anything, and then suddenly there's this large amount of additional electricity. And so what has been found in many of these studies, especially in smaller geographies, is that there's not much impact from even a large amount of distributed energy distribution on that overall trend of the need for the transmission. But they can have impacts on that, and with more fine-scaled ways of estimating things, those can be done. Similarly, with the, just saying one of the changes in the more recent studies is that they have started to separate out the distribution system for the transmission system, where the study included both, and do estimations around those separately and trying to do more fine-scaled estimations on the impacts on the distribution system in particular, including developing new methodologies for how to model that. And again, this is on that distribution system. One thing to keep in mind here is that doing the averages across distribution areas will often mask local areas where there could be a very large investment that is offset by distributed energy. But when you average it across a much larger system, it makes it seem like those are not as much system-wide. For example, there's the study done by Montana here that's mentioned, where they went through their system for that utility and looked at the specific substations and did assessments of whether or not some estimated amount of additional, in their case solar, but could also be done in terms of distributed energy resources, was enough to defer some planned distribution capacity investments in those substations or in a line, and assessed it that way. And now moving on to the social components, these are the items that have, just much more publicly available, much more transparent ways of making calculations of the impacts of greenhouse gases and climate change, and the local air emissions that come from primarily from fossil fuel generation. There are different reasons why community would want to include these costs or estimates of them in there in terms of just the being good to the neighbors, having a better environment. There is an economic rationale for valuing these things, and that is around the principle of externalities, and that is I might go and buy an apple from the store. And we have the value. We agree to that. I hand over my $1 for the apple, and we think that that's the value of the apple. But it turns out that they use a lot of pesticides growing the apples. They use unsound labor practices. It might have that getting that to the store has a whole bunch of other costs that just kind of fall on society at large and are not captured in that price that's done just between that market exchange. These are real costs that can be calculated, and the rationale for the policy intervention is to go ahead and correct for this market inefficiency, as the economists might say, so that we're properly paying not just for the benefits that we're getting from the electricity we get, but also to offset some of the negative consequences. The two largest of these that are looked at in the studies and that come from particularly fossil fuel generation are local air pollutants. And so these are sulfur dioxide, nitrous oxides, and particulate matter. They cause damages more in the short term. These are the air pollutants that they cause smog, they cause particulate matter, that the more that we've researched over the years, we find to have greater health consequences than we previously realized. And those can be determined down to a fairly fine scale geographic level and address those different costs on a county by county basis even, or doing specific modeling from individual power plants or emission sources. So in the most recent 4 studies here have all quantified both the avoided cost of carbon and the other avoided environmental costs. They've done this by using, regulatory compliance costs. In the Northeast, there's a regional greenhouse gas initiative where utilities actually have to pay if they were going to exceed their emissions limits. They might do proprietary models. They use the social cost of carbon that we'll talk about in a second. Or in the older studies that use just the straight value of renewable energy credits, but those typically have not been done in the more recent studies. And what are the impacts of including externalities on electricity calculations? And so these 3 maps show the estimates of what they call the levelized cost of electricity. So this is a way of comparing what it costs to generate 1 megawatt hour from wind versus solar versus gas. And these maps are from a study done by the University of Texas Energy Institute, where they did a deep dive into how much these generation technologies cost in each county in the United States. And then they did the deep dive and calculated what were the air pollution damages from local air pollution in each county of the United States, and what were the greenhouse gas emissions damages from these, which do not vary on a county by county basis, but those are the same wherever the emission occurs in a given year. And you can see in the upper left where there are no externalities included in the calculations. Yet wind is still the cheapest source of electricity in the Midwest. Gas is the cheapest source for just about the entire rest of the country. If you do a low social cost of carbon, what has been the typical social cost of carbon recommended by the US government for the last decade up until about 3 or 4 years ago, doing that lower value gets where solar starts to expand, where it's the cheapest in the US, primarily in the desert Southwest, but also a little bit in the Midwest. And then if you do what is the currently recommended value on the social cost of carbon, you see that now, if we include that in the price, the wind and solar are the 2 cheapest generation technologies. Now, levelized cost of electricity has a lot of limitations in what it shows. It doesn't capture the variability of the resources. It doesn't capture the other system integration costs that come along with that. But those are, so keeping that in mind, that shows the impact of including those externalities. And so this is an illustrative chart that shows the damage estimates of local air pollution per megawatt hour from, I went ahead and pulled data for all of the major fossil existing generation resources in the Nebraska fleet. So both for OPPD, NPPD, and LES. And you can see the estimated damages in 2020 from megawatt hour of electricity generated ranged from about $85, 70 to $85 for the Omaha Public Power District station in North Omaha and the NPPD Sheldon station, down to for the natural gas that's at the Terry Bundy generating station for LES is down less than $5. And again, this is estimating damages in 2020 and the near term subsequent years based on the emissions of the sulfur dioxide, nitrous oxides, and the particulate matter. This is a little more about social cost of carbon, and it's a very dense chart here. And the main thing that I want to emphasize here is that this is from a study done by a think tank called Resources for the Future. They did an updated estimation of the social cost of carbon that overcame a lot of the previous limitations. They did it taking into account uncertainties and ran thousands of simulations of future damages. They used different discount rates because it can come up with that affects the social cost of carbon considerably. And whereas for a decade or more, the recommended amount had been about $50 to $60 per ton of CO2 emitted, this study and more recent studies have come up with this higher values. In this case, about $185 a ton was their central estimate. These are, if you apply those, showing the differences of if you apply that low central estimate and high estimate from that study to the levels of greenhouse gas emissions from the Nebraska generating fleet, and just shows what impact that has on how you would estimate the current damages. And this one, I included this chart just to demonstrate that solar PV, geothermal, wind, battery, nuclear, these generation technologies that we think of as not emitting greenhouse gases, do still have greenhouse gases associated with the electricity they produce. That's from the cement that goes into the construction of a nuclear power plant, the energy that it takes to do the steel, to manufacture the solar photovoltaic cells, et cetera. And so if you include that in your life cycle estimate of emissions, you can say that there are emissions associated with those technologies, and that would be accurate. But again, it shows it compared to when you add the ongoing emissions from the combustion of natural gas and coal, far exceeds what those one-time emissions are. And with that, I will stop presenting and take questions. And sorry for going a little bit over.
No, that's wonderful. Thank you, Keith. Because we are doing this as a Zoom meeting instead of a webinar, you will be able to raise your virtual hand, unmute, and ask a question directly. But if you would also like to put questions into the chat, I can monitor those and maybe field and aggregate those as Keith is responding to other questions or responses. So having said that, and having received a tremendous amount of very relevant information, invite questions. So the first question from Ken: yes, slides will be available. So the entire recording will be available. So I will, after we're finished here, I will clean up the recording and I will post it, and I'll send out the link to everybody who registered for the event. And then it looks like we've got Vern, you've got your hand up, so we'll go ahead and begin with you. You can unmute.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, so I was talking to somebody from Conservation Nebraska yesterday afternoon, and the topic came up and this is kind of off topic a little, but it's dealing with converting farm or cropland or acreages to solar, and the idea that the acreage, when it gets converted to solar, it raises the value of the property. So the farmer that may own that property could actually make more money with solar, leasing his land. And the kind of the use case I'm looking at is I live in Papillion, Nebraska. There's quite a few farm fields that are in the residential area, and you have to ask, what is going on those farm fields, as far as pesticides, nitrates, the corn sweat, the minute bugs that come out of the farm fields, and the fall when you want to be outside, you're getting stung by all these bugs. I'm kind of motivated to try to advocate for getting rid of these or converting these cornfields in the residential areas to solar. Is that viable or am I way off base?
So it is a little off topic. This is an issue that I do work on. So the various factors that come up there, right? You're going to have questions around, if they're in residential areas, the residences that are closest to that are going to have questions about the sort of development and working with the neighbors there. The other terms, in terms of the basics of is it viable, will depend on where are the transmission lines, where are the electrical substations, how much might that sort of thing cost. So on in the question of is it viable, far too uncertain to say in general. The other thing I could comment on that you mentioned in terms of the just sort of high value of leases for whatever property owners for renewable energy generation have typically been very cost competitive, if not, better than other potential uses in some areas. Again, not commenting specifically on that location, just talking about general trends.
Thank you, Vern. Looks like we've got one question in the chat. Keith, if you want to read that, but I'll read it out for others. So it sounds like there's a diversity in methodology to produce a useful and informative value of solar study. Are there experts in this field that could assist utilities in undertaking the process?
Yeah, there absolutely are. There are, programs where, especially if it's like a state regulator or a public utility that might be able to take advantage of assistance from Department of Energy laboratories that provide technical assistance in these areas. There may be funding that that can cover that. Any number of the sort of energy and environmental consultancies that work on these sorts of issues do these, that several of that, just not to endorse any company, but I note that the Montana study was done by Navigant Consulting. So a lot of these studies were done directly by them. And then there are also folks who may not directly do the studies, but consult on other aspects of it, on this sort of the translating them into plain language, on helping understand the different options. Again, whether at those large consultancies or otherwise. And so, yeah, there's no shortage of expertise, and happy to, especially when it comes to sort of national labs, to help track down the right people to the extent that that's a viable pathway.
That's great, thank you. Looks like Ken has his hand up, so Ken Winston will ask you to unmute.
Thanks, Dan, and thanks, Keith, for your presentation. One of the things that I'm very interested in is the impacts of rates, and you indicated the value of solar study, and I guess what kinds of rate impacts and what kinds of incentives are necessary, and in particular because of the fact that the federal tax credits are going away, and it seems to me that if you're valuing solar, it should be to, if the utility wants to have more solar deployed, they're going to have rates and other incentives that will make that happen. So have you looked into that as well?
So this particular set of studies typically did not include that. These were meant to just be the sort of like the stack that we had there, system costs, et cetera. What kind of cost benefits and burdens are there from the value of solar? But definitely plenty of studies that have been done in that area that are sort of would be informed by what comes out of the value of solar studies, among other things, but then also helps guide those more policy decisions by the utility, right? If it makes decisions of, we want to achieve, the sorts of goals that the utilities have in the longer term in terms of the decarbonization by 2040 and 2050. So plenty of material out there that has can inform those sorts of things, not necessarily in these specific studies.
That's great. So we've got a question to follow up on the studies about whether they usually have a report covering the methods, assumptions, findings, what sort of information is typically included, what sort of depth, is it a one-pager? So I think especially, I'd imagine in the context of LES conducting this study as we're talking about it, kind of what would be best practices that you would hope to see go into a final deliverable like that?
So the studies, the ones that we looked at here, were pretty much that, there was some sort of written report. A couple of the studies had Excel spreadsheet calculators or even an online calculator that they developed that the commenting public or that could be utilized by planners going forward on some of these questions. Especially when I talked about this sort of taking into account the uncertainties or showing the sensitivities to different assumptions. Providing that sort of tool where people could say, oh, well, they said distribution only has this kind of cost impact. What if I raise that by this amount? Or what if I wanted to use a different amount for my local air pollution value? I wanted to use an SPP average value instead of something that's plant specific. So they have that kind of calculator. The reports generally come with a written report of, might be 30, might be a few hundred pages. It might be things, right? Some of these are like really, they vary a lot in how much kind of bespoke modeling they have done on these different specific issues. So that impacts it. But I think that the sort of baseline best practice is that, you're looking for all this complex stuff into plain language, transparent about what the assumptions are, that somebody commenting on it can follow through. And often, especially where these were done, by a state regulator, there were, even public comment processes as part of the development of the study. Or the study was issued and then there were public comments because the regulator was going to take some sort of action, like determine what that, rate would be, assessed at or would be paid for the solar going on there.
So especially in Nebraska, where we had the benefit of public power and democratized energy, this matter of transparency seems like it would be especially appropriate. I see a question that especially touches on your background in law having to do with the greenhouse gas endangerment findings. So the question is, do you have a sense of how these calculations will be affected in practice? That is to say, with power districts, with the repeal of the greenhouse gas endangerment finding, does that change the outlook on how some of these calculations are expected to be undertaken?
Consult your lawyer, whoever your lawyer may be, where you actually need the legal advice. But the general non-legal view is that the repeal of that, or the sort of the endangerment finding, or the changes in some of the other ways that the federal government now is evaluating some of the cost benefits in the regulatory systems, don't have to have any impact for utilities or state or local governments that are doing this, right? There's not a direct flow through that says you can or cannot do something. Or because the government did do a particular cost benefit analysis previously doesn't mean that, any utilities, whomever following along, would have to follow that either. I'll note that in my presentation, I did try to make a point of grabbing the peer-reviewed scientific studies. There's a whole bunch of additional information that's, from EPA directly. So I guess one impact is that when I put together this presentation, I grabbed, more original sources and less of, the existing summaries that are still there, not because those have gone away, but because I know that there's more politics around them now. Or maybe always were politics, but you know what I mean.
Yeah, that's great. I think one question that I've been kind of sitting with in the back of my mind, especially following that and in the context of Nebraska public power, do you have a sense of what has inspired leaders and officials to take a more robust approach to studying and utilizing value of solar? Because in kind of public discourse, I could imagine opposition ultimately being refuted and overcome with arguments that center around all these considerations. Do you have, either in your experience or in some of the research and scholarship, a sense of what are the messages and what are the approaches that have been effective in helping elected officials and leaders take a more robust approach to values of solar?
Not specifically for, say, these studies or for the sort of determining the scope of those studies of what has worked or not, or even what the particular sort of small p politics were around deciding to do them in different areas. In some areas it was because they had RPS measures, renewable portfolio standards that they were trying to promote, so there was that regulatory incentive to do it. In other places, it was because, say in California, I think some of the earliest studies were done because they're like, well, I'm really getting a lot of rooftop solar with this net energy metering. We need to figure out a better balance of how this is impacting the system. I think that for me right now, and this is part of why I put the context slide up front. I think everything in the next 5 years, even in states where we've had pretty stable electricity prices, is going to be around affordability and energy affordability. And I think that there's no shortage of research showing the potential. And so the potential, let's just say that, is that for both the solar and distributed energy resources more broadly to provide some of the lowest cost interventions that can be done to take load off the system, to reduce those peak capacity times, to make more efficient use of existing infrastructure. And so I think it's an affordability right now and in the next few years, even more so than, many people will be very motivated by the climate and environmental concerns. I work largely on clean energy, but everybody's concerned about the sort of cost of living and the price affordability. So that's, and like I said, it's not like you have to make it up to make the connection there. The studies clearly show. And I'll give one little plug for virtual power plants as a thing that I didn't have time to talk about, but in terms of that, actually taking advantage of the ability to coordinate and control these distributed resources as more of a resource for the utility that they're not just responding to, but can help manage, really starts to unlock some value for the utility and all of their ratepayers.
Yeah, that's terrific. We've got one final question, and I think it's appropriate to kind of pull us back out to a broader perspective because we've gotten into details that are all tremendously important. But question kind of just reframing or reminding us, how is the value of solar used? Does it provide information to the utility to determine if promoting distributed solar is valuable? Or does it provide information to the individual considering solar to incentivize them to install a system? So is it demand side, supply side, all sides? Kind of what's the value, so to speak, of value of solar?
I think I'll almost always go with an answer of all sides, but I think in particular now in this context, the sort of doing the resource planning, the longer term, the sort of the value of solar, value of DER, the distributed energy resources, is for not just the utility, but for the ratepayers, and doing it in that transparent, simplified way so that we can have a better understanding of the choices we're making, maintaining reliability and capturing some of these other values.
Yeah, that's fantastic. I saw one hand go up right as I was speaking. So Dorian, we'll give you the last word if you want to go ahead and unmute.
Yeah. Hey, Keith. Thank you for the presentation. I just wanted to know if there's one thing that you would like to see changed. If there was, what would that be? If you could change something tomorrow in regards to the topic we're on.
So again, doing it in general, I think that it's the unsolicited advice that I would give to whether it's policymakers or utilities is to expend some effort trying to determine the value of solar and of the distributed energy resources, and expending effort trying to figure out how that fits into the broader plans. Don't just think of it as this kind of niche thing over here, but how can we really use this to maintain affordability in the system and improve our environmental performance? It's that should be a core part, or I would recommend it be a core part of the planning and thinking.
That's outstanding. Well, thank you so much, Keith, for joining us. Thank you to everybody who was able to make time to be with us here real time this evening. As I said, we'll send out the recording afterwards. I'll clean this up and I'll send it to everybody who registered. So please feel free to share that. I'll send Keith's contact information along with that. So if you have any follow-up questions, whether they're technical, whether they're big picture, you've now got a resource who's got connections here in Nebraska and who's already shown a willingness to help as we go through the discernment process of resource planning moving forward. So thank you all for making time to be with us tonight. Have a wonderful evening and look for an email here in the next couple of days. Thanks again, Keith.